Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you are, know that you are the reason we've met here today. And thank you for tuning in and telling your friends and family and caring. While we might be interacting through screens again tonight, I see hope that in some cases the pandemic has made possible what otherwise might not. My name is Tim O'Leary, and I've been fortunate to work with a wonderful planning team to organize this event. About 7 weeks ago, I sent a tweet into cyberspace to no one in particular to see if anyone in Vermont wanted to organize a statewide screening of Coded Bias. People responded who did not know each other, and magic happened along with a bit of hard work and some good fortune. A planning team formed that includes Jane Adams, Elisa Braden Harder, Lucy Delabriere, Charlie MacFadyen, Pam McKenzie, Maureen McElhaney, Andy Mosdale, and myself. We introduced ourselves and set to work. We've now offered over 500 tickets for free so Vermonters could see Coded Bias over this past week, and we'll give away more tickets in the coming week. We just extended the window for Vermonters to get tickets to watch this important film until the end of this coming Friday, the 18th. Please visit, please visit our Coded Bias Vermont screening website for more information. You can find that site at tinyurl.com/codedbiasvt. It's also in the description of this YouTube live stream. We've also centered this Vermont screening on Computer Science Education Week. We created and curated and shared learning resources on our website about artificial intelligence and ethics for kindergartners, professional coders, and everyone in between. As our planning grew, so did those who stepped forward to financially sponsor these 2 weeks, including this event tonight. I want to share a special and sincere thanks for our financial sponsors. This 2-week event is made possible with leading financial support from the Vermont Community Foundation. Additional financial sponsors include Competitive Computing, Fresh Tracks Capital, 7 Days, the Vermont chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science, Vermont NEA, the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, and near and dear to my heart, a Rowland Foundation Fellowship that my colleague Charlie MacFadyen and I are leading that is aimed to build a K-12 computer science program in our school district with a specific lens to empowering female, non-binary, and gender non-conforming youth. Clearly, we're really lucky to live in Vermont, surrounded by groups and organizations such as these. And our design of tonight was to host a robust conversation at the intersections of topics Coded Bias so clearly presents to us: racial bias, computer science, and the pursuit of justice. And we wanted this conversation to join voices from our brave little state of Vermont with those who created and are featured in this film. And I'm thrilled that our panel represents these goals. Prior to tonight, we collected questions that were submitted and upvoted by Vermonters, and I've passed those on to our moderator. For you watching live on YouTube, that live chat function is available. While our panelists won't be responding to the chat, we encourage you to engage with each other. Even now, tell us who you are and where you're watching from. It'd be great to see you there. I'll introduce our moderator tonight, and she'll introduce our other panelists. Traci Griffith will both be part of our panel and moderate the discussion. Traci is an associate professor of media studies, journalism and digital arts, and the college pre-law coordinator at St. Michael's College. Her particular interests are in media law, ethics in the media, intellectual freedom and censorship, and racial and ethnic representation in media. And prior to joining St. Michael's College, she was a correspondent with the Associated Press. She also worked as a national editor for the Associated Press Broadcast Division in Washington, D.C. Utilizing her law degree and years of professional journalism, her teaching focus on the legal and ethical boundaries of modern media and technology, with particular attention to privacy and free speech. We couldn't have picked somebody better to help moderate the discussion tonight. Traci, welcome, thank you, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm so looking forward to hearing you have this conversation this evening.
Thank you so much, Tim. I am so happy to be here. This film has come at such an important time in our history, and it is going to be very interesting to hear from our panelists tonight. So let me start off by introducing them. So Shalini Kantayya she created this film, this documentary. It premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival. She has also directed an episode of the National Geographic television series Breakthrough that was executive produced by Ron Howard. And it was broadcast broadly in 2017. Her debut feature film, Catching the Sun, premiered at the Los Angeles Film Festival, and it was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Catching the Sun released globally on Netflix on Earth Day in 2016 with executive producer Leonardo DiCaprio, and it was nominated for an Environmental Media Association Award for Best Documentary. Additionally, she is a TED Fellow, a William J. Fulbright Scholar, and a finalist for the ABC Disney DGA Directing Program. She's an associate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, Shalini. Next, we have Meredith Broussaud, and she appeared in this documentary. She is a data journalist, an assistant professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of New York University, and the author of Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. She is an affiliate faculty member at the Moore Sloan Data Science Environment at the NYU Center for Data Science, a 2019 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow. She's also worked as a software developer at AT&T Bell Labs and the MIT Media Lab. Welcome, Meredith. And last but not least, we have Vermont's own Randall Harp. Randall is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Vermont. He's currently the 2020 Fulbright Canada Pierre, Elliott, Trudeau Foundation Fellow, Joint Chair in Contemporary Public Policy. He does research in the philosophy of the behavioral and social sciences, social metaphysics, and data and technology ethics. So welcome, Randall. It's wonderful to have the three of you here tonight. So let's start off with, why is this an issue? I mean, anybody who saw the documentary realizes why it's an issue, right? But what brought you to this work? Why was it important for you to get this story out?
Oh, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm so thrilled to share this with the Vermont community. You know, I sort of stumbled upon this story 2 years ago. I didn't know what an algorithm was. And I think I came across the work of Joy Buolamwini, a TED Talk that she had given. And sort of then I sort of tugged on the string of like, okay, I'm going to read Cathy O'Neil, Weapons of Math Destruction, and then Meredith Broussard's Artificial Unintelligence, and Sophia Mojanoble's Algorithms of Oppression. And so I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole of this, I think, untapped genius inside Silicon Valley who had been offering a commentary for a long time. And I think that for me, as sort of a lay person, not a data scientist or a mathematician, everything I know about AI has come from the brain of Steven Spielberg or Stanley Kubrick or some sort of science fiction. And I'm so grateful to people like Meredith Broussard for giving me an education and helping me understand what AI really is in the now, and what our misconceptions are about AI. And I think, you know, I didn't really realize the extent to which human beings are already outsourcing our decision-making to machines. I didn't understand that AI was already making decisions about who gets what quality of healthcare, who gets into college, who gets hired, how long a prison sentence someone serves, all of these things that sort of are shifting human destiny. are already being decided by AI. And the thing is, what I didn't understand, and the thing that was most terrifying to me in the making of this film that I didn't understand when I set out to make this film, is that I didn't understand that these same systems that we're trusting with such, with our most sacred decisions, have not been vetted for racial bias or gender bias, or that they won't do harm to others, that they're even accurate in the first place. They haven't even been vetted in some cases for even just basic accuracy. And yet they are governing opportunity on so many levels. And that's when I really began to understand that this is a civil rights issue. That everything that we love as people of a democracy, everything that we've sort of fought for 50 years, fair employment, fair housing, a criminal justice system that just doesn't disparately target people of color. All of the things that we fought for 50 years could be rolled back against this sort of guise that machines are neutral, that they don't discriminate. And then the other thing that I learned that was so terrifying to me in the making of this film is that it's a black box, that these systems can't be questioned, and that all the power is in one side. And what I learned is that knowledge is power. And in the film, there's so many people who fought against the power of big tech, and not just amazing people with advanced degrees like Meredith, who help us translate the science, but everyday people like Brooklyn residents who fought against a landlord arbitrarily trying to put facial recognition. They're not in a compound. They're not like in some prison somewhere. They're just trying to go home, and they're fighting facial recognition inside their homes. And I feel like with all of these things, with all of these situations, a teacher fighting against unfair judgment of them being evaluated as a bad teacher based on an arbitrary algorithm that hasn't been vetted for bias. And I think what I learned is that these systems are black box. All the power is on one side. And so I think with coded bias, I'm so grateful to people like Meredith for giving me an education that I'm able to share. Because what I learned is that this incredible power, this incredible knowledge shouldn't be in the hands of a few. Not when they're disseminated on all of us, not when they're making such intimate decisions that define human destiny and opportunity and civil rights. And so what I hope the film does is help translate it. And one of the high compliments is like someone told me they like shared it with their immigrant mom, and their immigrant mom was talking about AI. And that's what I hope Coded Bias does, is help us to realize that AI, we can't afford to leave it to the small group of elite, mostly white men from elite backgrounds that have been sort of governing it for stewarding this power, that we all should have a place at the table. And not just in terms of, I feel like sometimes people talk about inclusion as if it's something that's like good for the pictures. It's like, oh, it's a nice to have, and it's a social service we're doing. And like, I think what I learned in the making of this film is like, no, you're not doing a social service. Like, the people who I've centered in my film are the untapped genius of Silicon Valley. And it's never been so clear to me that the people who have been systematically missing from the conversation have the most to teach us about the way forward. And I think what I've learned is that this is a moment, a pinnacle moment, to call for more humanity in the technologies that will define our future.
Okay, so
that's a lot. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. Meredith, maybe you can, this is a large question. Maybe you can help us, those of us who are not technologically inclined, understand why this is such an issue. How does it affect us?
How does it affect us? This is a good question. So thank you so much for having me tonight. I think that one of the things that Shalini's film does so powerfully is it provides a really accessible way in to understand what AI is and is not. AI is a broad field. Facial recognition technology is one part of it. And one of the things we learned through watching Joy Buolamwini's journey and discovery is we learn how facial recognition technology can be weaponized and turned into facial surveillance technology. And we learn, why is this a terrible idea? For a very long time, there was an idea that was kind of the default in society, which is an idea called techno-chauvinism. The idea that computers are superior, technological solutions are superior to all other solutions. And instead, what I think we should do is we should ask, what is the right tool for the task? Because sometimes the right tool is a computer, and sometimes it's something simple like a book in the hands of a child sitting on its parent's lap. And one is not better than the other. But when people feel intimidated by technology, when they think technology is so complex that they can't possibly understand it, then they feel like they don't have a voice in the decisions that are being made by technology and on our behalf using technology. So one of the things that I think is so important about the film is it empowers people to understand how the technology works, what is at stake, and I hope that watching the film, people understand that they can push back, just like the Brooklyn tenants in the film who said, no, we do not want facial surveillance in our buildings. We want to be able to use a plain old key in our apartment doors instead of having to go through this ridiculously complicated facial recognition system that doesn't work, and especially doesn't work on people of color.
Okay, let me push back on that a little bit. And then Randall, I'm coming to you. So as an example, the folks who live in that Brooklyn building, let's say the landlord is able to show that using facial recognition technology to kind of control who is able to enter the building, right, cuts down on vandalism in the building or reduces crime in the neighborhood or in the building. Couldn't that be used as a justification for the use of that technology?
I mean, that would be really nice. But the problem is that there's no technology that gets us away from the essential problems of human nature, right? So because there is more surveillance doesn't mean there's less crime, right? Adding more technology does not actually solve the problem. So it's a little bit like the people who want to build apps to end homelessness. Yes, absolutely, we should be using technology in the kind of service delivery chain, but the thing that solves homelessness is giving people homes. It's not apps, right? So we need to just address the root of the problem. You know, let's look at systemic racism. Let's look at the problem of poverty. Let's look at the problem of inequality. There are lots of ways that we can address crime that are not about increasing surveillance. And the problem with facial recognition technology is that these kinds of technologies are disproportionately weaponized against communities of color in policing. And so the solution is not, oh, let's make the technology better so that we recognize more people of color. The solution is don't use the technology until and unless it works for everybody, which is really a point we're never going to see. So Joy Buolamwini and her organization, the Algorithmic Justice League, have put together something called the Safe Face Pledge, which I have signed, which you can check out at the Algorithmic Justice League site. And it gives you a lot of information about why facial recognition technology is such a bad idea to use in policing. And Vermonters, I understand, know really well that facial recognition technology is a terrible idea to use in policing. I understand you've had some legislation around this.
Yes, absolutely. So the Vermont ACLU, along with a number of other organizations, have really been following the issue for quite a while, right? Back in, I think it was 2004, there was a Vermont state law that restricted the collection of biometric data, such as facial recognition, right? Fast forward a few years, the ACLU comes to find out that the Vermont DMV is actually using facial recognition technology. And they pushed back on that, saying this was in violation of the law, right? This doesn't seem to fit. To push that a little bit further, they found out that the DMV was also providing that data to federal agencies, such as the FBI and Immigration Naturalization Service, right? And so the ACLU really saw it kind of as a question of privacy, a question of oversight in terms of who's collecting the information and what are they doing with it. And then also a big question that you bring up in the film, accuracy, right? In terms of who's being identified and are they accurately being identified? One of the really great things that I saw that I noticed in the film when they talked about when they ran the facial recognition technology on members of Congress and how many members of Congress were misidentified as being criminals, right? Well, that's debatable. We'll leave that there, but yeah, so it was so interesting. And so Vermont has actually, just a few months ago, they passed a law, S-124, which basically, it's the strongest limit on the use of facial recognition technology as it relates to law enforcement, right, here in Vermont. And it basically prohibits police from using facial recognition technology in law enforcement. So yeah, Vermont is leading, right? Vermont is really leading a lot of this, which is wonderful to hear. So, Randall, let's go to you. One of the lines out of the film, and Meredith kind of referenced it, is there's no algorithm to define what is just, right? What are the ethics of using this kind of technology, and where are we failing? In terms of the lack of humanity in the algorithm.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, before I start on that, I do want to say thank you to Shalini for making the film. It was fantastic. And I'll just say, when I was watching the film, it was kind of funny because I knew it was centered around Joy Buolamwini's work, but I kind of realized when I was watching it that all these other people whose work has kind of inspired me so much and I've learned so much from also kept appearing throughout the film. I was like, oh, like there's, Tunic Gabriel, there's, there's Zan Prefecti, there's, Sophia Noble, there's all these people whose work I follow, including Meredith as well, who's on this call. So I'm happy to see her here too. I've learned quite a lot from your stuff, man. So thank you. And I don't think it's an accident that, that the film centers around the experiences of women and women of color in particular, because like being able to have that perspective, I think when your perspective is not already centered in some of these discussions in Silicon Valley or wherever, it's much easier to see what might arise from this kind of, how might this impact people who are already in disadvantaged positions if you're not already in a privileged position. So that kind of goes back to your question, Traci, like, well, you don't really have an algorithm that measures justice. Well, that's right. When we think about AI, and Meredith said this earlier, AI is not one thing, but what ties a lot of these AI technologies together is kind of two different strands, right? On the one hand, you have a way of measuring some feature of the world that we care about. And the other hand, there's usually like implicitly some value which is attached to those measurements. And so the things that we can measure in a certain way, like, does this face look like that face? Or, does this, do these particular traits that the person have make them more likely to recidivate in the future? Or, all these things that we can kind of find ways of measuring. Those are the things that you can really unleash AI algorithms on. But the problem with that, of course, is that first, the things that we can measure are not necessarily the things that we ought to care about. So, right, of course, when you have a hammer, everything's like a nail, right? When you have an algorithm, everything looks like the sort of problem that can be solved by an algorithm. And that's already problematic because the things that we can measure are not necessarily the things that we ought to be caring about. And justice is not a thing that we can just measure, right? There's no easy scale to say, oh, well, here's a state of the world where there's more justice, here's a state of the world where there's less justice, right? You already need to have these substantive discussions about what counts as justice. And no AI algorithm is going to get you that. But the other problem is that once you get the AI algorithms in the picture, like human beings, especially when, as Shalini said earlier, as Meredith said, especially when you don't actually know how the algorithms are working, right? When the algorithms are not what we call explainable, then people are just inclined to trust them. They're inclined to believe them. You say, oh, like, I don't know exactly how this decision came down the pipeline, but it's an AI thing, and it was made by some engineers somewhere, so it must be right. And so without knowing exactly how this thing came up with this judgment, you just put more trust in it. So you aren't able to actually open up these substantive discussions about, well, what would a just distribution of these particular resources, what would a just world look like? You can't have that discussion when people are already saying, well, the algorithm says to do this, so we're going to do it this way, even though we don't know exactly why we're doing it that way or what it means. So, yeah, so I do think that those discussions need to be baked into the very beginning. I think, what is the reason for measuring these things and for trying to find this way of having an algorithmic solution to these problems? And what other ways could we be doing? What other ways could we be doing that? As Meredith said, like, not every problem is solvable by AI. Some problems are solvable by a kid with a book on a bed. Other problems are solvable by us actually having the meaningful conversations about what values we ought to hold or share. And again, like, those conversations usually aren't in there at the ground floor when the algorithms are being built.
I think you touched on something here. This is for anyone on the panel. In the film, you discuss the notion of power, right? That the real problem with the use of algorithm is that those who have the power to control those algorithms assign the value to the things that we're discovering through them, right? Like, you can identify certain attributes that are positive and other attributes that are negative through the algorithm. And then there's some kind of value assigned to those. Let's talk a little bit about that notion of power and how, and the terms that I'm learning, through the film, algorithmic harm and algorithmic oppression, right? And the notion of power and oppression. How does that all fit into this?
Well, I think that notions of power and oppression and justice are kind of the backdrop to all of the issues that are talked about in the film, and there's certainly the backdrop to all of my own work about algorithmic harm, around AI ethics, and just kind of in my pursuits in general. I think, Randall, you said something really interesting about the difference between justice and what an AI can determine. I always think of it as the difference between fairness and justice. And I started thinking about justice being more important than fairness through Joy's work. Joy makes the point that fairness is not the same as justice. And so one of the things that we could achieve through better use of data is justice, but we choose not to. We choose to focus on systems that just replicate existing systems of oppression in the world. So in terms of oppression, I definitely recommend that everybody read Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression. In it, she looks at why Google search would when you Googled white girls, you would get images of girls. And then when you Googled Black girls, you would get porn. And after her book came out, Google changed this. They said, oh my, we had no idea. Oh yeah, we're so sorry. And they did change it. But when you Google Asian girls, you still have the same, the same awful results. Or when you Google, appropriate hair for work, you get images of white women. When you do inappropriate hair for work, you get images of Black women in braids. I mean, it's everywhere. And it's structural. And I think that one of the things that the film does so well is it illuminates just the extent of the problem of racism, of bias in computational systems.
Do you think this problem can be traced back to a lack of diversity in terms of those who are creating these programs? I mean, I think that the number was there are only 14% of women in the artificial intelligence field. Would it be different if these programs are being created by women of color?
I mean, it would certainly be a little bit better. For example, the Apple Watch, when it launched, did not have a period tracker as the default. The Apple Watch, there was all this hoo-ha about how many health apps it was going to have. And you know what? Half of the world keeps track of their menstrual cycle. And if you were actually going to make a technology that was egalitarian and helpful, you would have a period tracker as a default that you have to take off your watch, instead of making it so that you have to put it on, right? So Apple did, to their credit, they did fix it in a later release, but we are so far into the internet era now that there's really no excuse for these kinds of boneheaded decisions.
I will say that, in the making of Coded Bias, I met 3 Black women researchers who missed racial bias and facial recognition, who basically through their research shine a light on racial bias and facial recognition that IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon missed. That to me in itself is a rally cry for inclusion, not for reasons of do-gooderness, but just as reasons of how did they miss this this massive racial bias in technology that was already being sold to the FBI, already being sold to ICE, already being deployed by police departments. I'm so proud of what Vermont has done by banning facial recognition, because I really do believe that when you pass local legislation, it sort of creates a ripple effect. And I think that what I worried about in the making of this film is that so many different kinds of oppression will just become more opaque to us. And I did not realize the ways in which historic inequalities get encoded into AI systems that then just predict us to be who we were in the past. And we know that we transcend our data. I loved what Randall said, that said, the things that we can measure are not the things that we should care about. I will take that with me other places, because I think that sometimes, even with the idea of inclusion, that there's this idea that we can make a perfect algorithm. That is just we just need to fix the data, and we just need a perfect rainbow in the coding room to figure out how to do this. And I think that what Meredith is saying, what Randall is saying is really about building a more humane society, about figuring out how we have rules and how we have a certain standard of ethics so that we're not even prioritizing efficiency. I feel like we're on this race to like prioritize efficiency, and what we need to be optimizing for and what we need to prioritize is sort of the essential value of every human being. And that's the way I hope that we reframe the designing of these technologies.
Yeah, I'll jump into that really quickly, Traci. I saw you were about to say some more, but
No,
yeah, so
absolutely.
actually, the first thing I'll say, actually, to give Vermont a few more props, actually, so the Vermont AG did also kind of file a suit against Clearview AI for violating, kind of, so that's another important move that Vermont is taking. But as far as when we talk about kind of to what extent is this kind of baked into some of these structures of power, and yes, I mean I've certainly had conversations with engineers who would say, oh, like it's just a matter of faulty training data. So if you just fix that, then the problems will kind of go away, right? And look, okay, so the way I like to put that is, okay, first, if we imagine that it was really in some of these early kind of facial recognition systems' interest to be able to discriminate with much higher accuracy Black faces, they would have been able to do that, right? Like if that was the goal, they would be able to do that. And you say, well, like what kinds of use cases would a company have if they say, like, we really need to be able to discriminate Black faces? And when you think about like what kind of company would be trying to do that explicitly, you should start to be a little bit horrified. Like, why would they really want to do this? And look, there's a reason why so many Congress people were kind of had mistaken recognition with, let's say, kind of with people who were incarcerated, because initially, like a lot of these large facial training sets involved kind of basically, like I said, this disjunctive set, right? You had on the one hand a whole bunch of pictures of upper middle class white people in the Boston area, and then you had a lot of basically kind of facial mugshots from the prison system, and like those two sets just kind of mashed together. And so it was not be a surprise then that Black face would be more often kind of identified with the training, with the set of photos that came from the prison system, because of the way our prisons are constituted right now. So, and it also makes you think, yeah, like any company which really is trying to just be able to make sure that they get Black faces right is probably working with the prison system. They're probably working with law enforcement. They're working with people that have that interest. And that should make us think like, how do we fix that problem, right? Because that's the issue. Is it seems though when people take that to be a specific use case, they're already focusing on those areas of society where you already have these sorts of imbalances and injustices to begin with. So you can't solve that problem if you don't already kind of figure out what we need to do with society. But that's part of the reason why just fixing the training data is not going to be enough, because just fixing the training data doesn't actually address why it is that these systems are being used in the way that they are, what kind of the end goal is in the use of these systems, the application of these systems. And that's really, I think, what needs to be talked about more.
It seems that, the creators are flawed, and so therefore the creation is flawed. At least that's the way it seems, right? Looking from the outside, is it possible to create just algorithms? Is it possible to create, these systems that compile this data and information? And maybe Randall is right. Maybe we shouldn't even be worried or concerned about this information. But is it possible to create this kind of system that is just, or is it inherently unjust because the creator is inherently flawed? Meredith, you're muted.
Oh,
there you go.
yeah, you'd imagine 8 months into the pandemic, I would have stopped doing this by now. All right, so first of all, Randall is absolutely right. And I think that, Traci, what we need to do is kind of confront that fantasy. Confront the fantasy that somehow it's possible to write a perfect algorithm, to get so much data that we can predict everything. And we need to look at the fantasies that go along with that. like the fantasy of the frictionless world where everything gets delivered to you in your house, right? Like we need to look at, where do these fantasies come from? Well, they mostly come from Hollywood. They come from science fiction movies. And they come from the, kind of laziness of like a small and elite group of people who want to be catered to, which, we all want to be catered to. Obviously, I would love for somebody to come and do my laundry and, bring me dinner every night. But one of the things that the pandemic has kind of underscored is that the frictionless life, the life of the shut-in where your groceries get delivered and you just interact over the computer and you spend all your time on the internet, like this life just sucks. Like we want to be with other people. Like, I don't know about you, I'm desperate to not be in my house, to be interacting with people not on the computer. Like this whole fantasy that, you see playing out in films like Ready Player One, where you don't have to interact with anybody. Like, it's a kind of useless fantasy.
Shalini, now you're muted.
No, I just wanted to say it's all invented by guys who weren't charming enough to get dates in college. And they're like deploying technologies all over the world now.
I will say I won't defend that view exactly, but
it's a joke. It's meant to be joke.
It's a little close. No, I'll say, like I have a certain amount of sympathy for, again, some of the engineers that I might talk with who say, look, like, I'm just trying to solve this particular problem. And it can't be everyone's responsibility everywhere along the line to figure out like what the large scale implications of this technology might be. And I have some sympathy with that, although I also do think that kind of everybody who's responsible for doing coding and programming systems should at least have some understanding, right? I mean, in the same way that part of the kind of price of admission, as it were, for being a democracy is you have to at least be moderately informed about what society, like what kind of society you care about. Like, like everybody has that right to participate, but you should kind of, it's important like to have some view about things. Likewise, like if you're going to be designing these systems that have such a huge uptake, you should have some thoughtfulness about what the implications might be, but it doesn't need to be that everybody at every stage of the way is a complete expert. That being said, of course, like somebody should be an expert somewhere along the way. Like you can't just say, okay, like, all I'm trying to do is to solve the problem, and then whatever happens to it once it gets released, that's kind of up to the world. No. Like somewhere along the way, somebody needs to say, let's really think about the implications of this. And it is like, I think unfortunate that not only do not enough companies really care about having somebody in that position to say like, what's going on here, but they also don't seem to be sufficiently empowered to do some of these things. Again, I won't kind of, so there's going to be some references to Timnit's situation at Google, which I won't get into right now, although you guys are welcome to follow up on me if you want.
Yeah,
but,
we can get into it if you want.
No, exactly. Like I'm like I said, like I defer to you to go ahead and get into it. But all I will say is it seems as though people who are in these positions are not sufficiently empowered or valued by the organizations which ought to be relying on their expertise. So it doesn't need to be, so, okay, fine. Not everybody needs to always be having all these ideas in mind throughout the entire process, but somebody should, and everybody should at least think to themselves like, yeah, like what would the Black Mirror version of this technology be, right? Just so that I can like imagine to myself like how it could go very much off the rails, because I don't think people think about that nearly as much as they should be.
Well, so what would be the advantage for private corporations to take this on? Why would they even bother? I mean, it's working well for them right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's working really well for Mark Zuckerberg. It's working really well for Jeff Bezos. It's not working particularly well for the rest of us. So one of the things that Cathy O'Neill has talked about is the idea of an FDA for algorithms.
Yes.
And I think this is a terrific idea. In the same way that we have the FDA to regulate pharmaceuticals, and we have levels of medical and legal review that have to be that companies have to go through before they release drugs into the market. And when there is a misstep, like the opioid crisis, Like the FDA is empowered to put more controls in place for the public good. There's a lot of evidence for the idea that we should be doing this for algorithms as well. So if we did have an FDA for algorithms, they would probably look at the facial recognition technologies that are covered in the film, and they would say, no, you can't use these in policing because they're inaccurate. They give false results. They're unequal. They are just poorly implemented technologies. And it is not safe or fair to use them in policing.
So she also said that she viewed this as the largest civil rights issue of our time, right? In the film, I think she identified this issue as the largest civil rights issue of our time. But there's so many people in our society who, it's the kind of, if you're not guilty, then why would you run from the police? If you're not guilty of something, why would you be afraid of having, facial recognition technology on the street? Or why would you, so what would you say to those people? How is this affecting our lives in ways that we don't understand? Or is this just I have nothing to hide, so why should I be worried about it? Who wants to jump on that one?
Well, with respect to this being kind of a kind of talking about this as a civil rights issue, I was going to follow up on what Meredith was saying earlier. We've long since accepted the idea that individual market decisions or individual consent transactions are not sufficient to avoid social level harm. Like the marketplace has already accepted that. So like it can't just be that just because like I want to buy this thing and you want to sell it means it's an okay transaction. Sometimes those buying and selling of things harm society in ways that society collectively says we're not going to allow that sort of thing. Likewise, if I just want to say as an individual, let's say shop owner, I just don't want to allow any Black people into my shop. We've long since decided that kind of individual right that you have over your business is not sufficient because there are harms to society, right? Because those harms don't just affect the one person who's waiting outside your shop, they affect everybody who's going to be kind of classed in that way, classed as Black inside or whatever it is. We have not yet kind of gotten beyond this framework when we think about technologies that whatever the individual consumer wants to do is okay. Like as long as you consent as an individual to using this product, it's okay. Like that is a terrible system for solving these problems, but that's still the one that we have. You click the little box that says, I consent to Facebook using all this data of mine. And then it's like, oh, that's okay all of a sudden. No, it's not okay, right? It's really not okay. And yet that's still the framework that we're working with. So yeah, something like an FDA would be more effective in saying like this is a society level problem. It needs a society level solution.
And I agree with you. And I want to go back to what you're saying about the engineers, because I don't want it to seem like I'm bashing, because I actually, what it is, I will tell you honestly, I was totally unprepared that Google, Microsoft, IBM, and Facebook have all requested screenings of coded bias, which is just incredible to me and stuff I never thought would happen. And a lot of them, I had the benefit of a Sundance screening where we were in person, and I had someone come up to me and say, this is a conversation we're having with ourselves, and you made a conversation we can all have together. And to me, that's at the heart of it. I realize that engineers a lot of times are well-meaning. And that's what's so terrifying, is that in spite of the best of their intentions, they can still hurt a mass amount of people by their decisions. And so to me, the answer is that we can't leave the tech bros alone in spite of their best intentions, that there's got to be ethicists, there's got to be this FDA, there's got to be some system in place. I'm so grateful that Vermont took a stance on your licensing, like that you brought up that the Vermont licensing. There was a moment in Congress where right-wing Republican, conservative, Jim Jordan of Ohio is agreeing with AOC, liberal of Queens, right? And basically is saying like, well, wait a minute. There's this moment where he says 117 million Americans are in a police database that people can access without a warrant. And there's no one that we elected that's overseeing this process. And that's when I began to see like this process that you're talking about with the driver's license in Vermont.
Yes.
And I'm so proud of your state for standing up against. 117 million Americans didn't opt into that database and now can be searched by police without a warrant. And so there's gotta be someone elected and that's when I began to realize, oh, this stuff is going from big tech to our children's hands, to our streets, to law enforcement with no guardrails in place whatsoever. And so that is what we need is some guardrails, an FDA, some sort of regulations to make sure that we don't leave a small group of people to act in their own interest and not in the interest of the collective.
Shalini, I was literally waiting for the other shoe to fall when you put the Jim Jordan clip in the documentary. I was like, wait a minute, that sounds reasonable. Where's the next thing that's coming here? And I was like, no, actually, he's going to say that one reasonable thing. Okay, fine, I'll take it.
I want to take it back to that question though, because I feel like the average person, like Randall identified, okay, so and we saw in the film with the Chinese young woman who was like, well, it's convenient, right? I just use my face and it's convenient. And so much of what this is built around in terms of individuals is convenience.
Mm-hmm.
We're willing to, oh, okay, well, yeah, there might be some things that might be negative, or maybe we don't even understand the negative aspects of it, but it's convenient, right? So are you screaming into the wind here? How do you convince the average person that this is a bad thing for them?
Well, to me, it's not a bad or a good thing. Like some people argue that China was the first to control COVID because they locked everybody down and they literally had, almost 750 million people under complete sort of lockdown. And people sort of say like, oh, is that more effective? Is that more? My question is really about who gets to decide. How are we making this decision as a society? Because these things are not something that we can decide today on this Zoom, right? Like how should this be used and when is it right to be deployed and when is it an asset for the public good of society? What I hope Coded Bias does is engage us all in the conversation about how and when these technologies should be used.
And I think just following up off of that, as far as the person says, well, like, what is the problem? Okay, so it's more accurate now, so it's not going to mistake my face for someone that I don't want to be mistaken with, right? So they've improved that in that sense. So why should I care? Well, again, like going back to the Clearview AI situation, right, which is a company which kind of acquired a massive amounts of photos from violating various terms of service from various companies, right? So scraping photos from Facebook and Twitter, anything which is kind of on the web, they tried to harvest that to use for their recognition. Well, again, like what's one of the biggest sources of photos of people? Well, it might be Facebook's set of photos. And what else does Facebook have? They've got a massive amount of behavioral data on their users, right? They've got not just kind of things that people enter about what they're doing, what they like, who their social networks are, all these things. Like all that information can be combined with any other measurements that we can find anywhere else in society. And all of those things can have, I think, a drastic impact, whether it's kind of, people sometimes say, oh, like I don't want the government to have this information. And I agree, like the government having this information is not great. But the thing about the United States, at least still, is that there are more safeguards on what the government can do and can't do with data. There's more transparency with what the government can do and can't do with data. Even putting aside all the NSA stuff, there's still more transparency with that than there is on private companies that have basically no requirements for how they can use their data. And so, yeah, like in some ways, I guess it's good that like in America, a lot of it's just being used to try to sell you stuff. But on the other hand, like when you're combining all this information, and of course the government can then buy that information back from the companies directly. They don't have to, they can't acquire it themselves by law, but they can buy it if you just want to sell it, right? All of that stuff allows for massive amounts of not just prediction, but control and influence over our behaviors in ways I think we ought to be worried about. Like essentially, like the more information we have about people, the more our autonomy eventually is going to be lessened. And in ways that we don't even necessarily know right now where it might go. But as kind of our social sciences get better, the more we can actually engage in manipulation and control people's behavior directly through the information that we have about them. And I think that nobody's kind of willing right now to say, yes, like I'm happy to have my autonomy undermined by, just in order to have a more convenient way of getting access to my house or to pay for something at a store or whatever.
Meredith?
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. I would also go back to something you said a few minutes ago about kind of is it possible to write the perfect algorithm? And I think that one thing that's important in thinking about this is humility. When you imagine that you're the person who can write the perfect algorithm, it's an enormous amount of hubris. And I think I think when we are writing code, we need to be humble and say, okay, we all have blind spots. We all have unconscious bias. We're working on it. We're trying every day to become better people, but none of us is without flaws. I have a lot of blind spots. I've gotten rid of a lot of blind spots, but I still have some. And so the idea that I'd be able to make a perfect algorithm assumes that I would have no blind spots, and there's simply nobody out there like that, right? So a little bit of humility is useful in finding a way through the idea, or pushing back against the idea of the perfect algorithm. And also a little humility is really useful in generating empathy. And empathy is one of the things that we need to draw on when we're imagining, okay, this algorithm, where is it going to fail? For whom is it going to fail? And in what context? And when we assume that the algorithm is going to fail, then we can make better predictions about when and if we should use a machine to make our decisions.
It's interesting that you use very, human traits to describe this thing that's artificial, right? Humility.
Well, I mean, technology is made by people, right? Like we do kind of imagine it as this kind of objective, unbiased thing. And yes, like technology is just math. Like a computer, what does it do? It computes. It literally computes, it calculates, like it's all about numbers. And yeah, there's definitely a dimension in which numbers are not, are not kind of, well, Randall could address this better than I. So math is mathematical, but it is also something that is socially constructed, and it operates in a different kind of system of symbolic logic than language. Yes, math is fantastic. Computers do math, but there are limits to what we can and should do with technology.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. We are coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to allow you all to give us your last thoughts. What do you hope people get from Coded Bias? Where do you want to see us go from here? Shalini, let's start with you.
Oh, well, I just hope that I'm so grateful for conversations like this one that center people in the conversation in a different way. And I'm so grateful that I've been a part of so many conversations that have centered women in the technologies of the future. I hope that people will see that we have a moonshot moment for ethics and technology. And I think a lot of these moments that we're having around, the win that we had around Microsoft, IBM, and Amazon changing their approach, their policy around sale of facial recognition to law enforcement, Timnit Gebru, ethicist at Google's firing. This is all giving us sort of this moment that we are in the stuff of deciding what ethics in AI looks like today, and that we all have a role to play. And so it's really my hope that that Coded Bias will all give us a place at the table to talk about the technologies of the future that impact our opportunities and our civil rights in the future, and that we'll all do something. And I also just want to say, Vermont specifically, that I'm so proud that you've banned facial recognition, that I believe that statewide change, that when states pass statewide legislation, tech companies won't want to create policy for 49 states and one. And so that local policy is one of the great tools that we have in making huge changes, because what happens locally then indicates what happens on the federal level. So I'm really excited to see all the incredible engaged local action that's taking a part on this issue. And I just want to say that I'm so proud to be part of a coalition of organizations that are working on this issue. And you can go to codedbias.com/take action and sort of engage with so many great organizations that are doing work in the field.
Excellent, thank you. Meredith?
It is my great hope that everybody goes to see this movie. Because Shalini has done an amazing job with Coded Bias. I think everybody in the world should know about Joy Buolamwini's work. I think everybody in the world should know about the work of the amazing thinkers that are in the film. It was such an honor to appear with all of them. And I hope the film sparks a lot of conversation about these important issues, which are really, as you said, like the most important civil rights issues of our lifetime.
Randall?
Yeah, thank you. No, I want to start by actually thanking you again, Traci, for moderating all of this, and thank Shalini and Meredith again for the fantastic film. I also encourage everyone to see it. All I would say is kind of my closing thoughts about the film is kind of going off a little bit what I said earlier. I think every kind of AI or machine learning application kind of has embedded within it a picture of a kind of ideal world. Like it might be explicit, it might be implicit, but usually embedded in there. And oftentimes that picture of an ideal world is kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say it's deeply conservative, but it reflects a particular viewpoint, right? So if you're talking about ways of evaluating resumes, well, it's going to privilege people that look sort of like the company looks right now, people that are successful in the company right now. Or if you're looking at kind of, crime prevention, like, well, what happened in the past and how can we kind of track arrests that happened in the past? It's always going to be kind of reflecting a picture of the world. And oftentimes people, who have already been successful just have a picture of the world that says the way things are right now is great. Let's get an algorithm that just replicates that. Now, so again, AI is not necessarily the problem, because you can get a better picture of the world and try to use these tools in order to advance towards that. I think that is certainly possible. But as Meredith said, we should always be humble about what these things are doing, how much we understand them, and what, kind of how much debate we can have over the picture of the world which is embedded in them, because we just haven't discussed that nearly as much as I think as we should.
Thank all of you so much for joining us tonight, and our viewers out there in the world, thank you so much for joining with us. Thanks for making the time for the conversation today. It was really enlightening. And Shalini, I tell you, these incredible women, Meredith, these incredible women that worked on this film, I was absolutely awed. I mean, incredible, incredible women. And hey, round of applause for all of you. Thanks for your hard work.